Good evening. My name is Tim Chapin. I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy here at Florida State University. Welcome to our second policy pub of the spring 2021 semester. For those of you that are new to the policy pub format, there used to be a policy pub. We'd meet in a pub and we'd meet in a local setting, and we would have an esteemed speaker talk about a topic of interest to the community, and we would share a drink and some questions and have a lovely evening together. You might have noticed there's this little thing called a pandemic that's affected the world for the better part of a year. We've moved to a pubinar format in which we're doing these pubinars online. For those of you that are joining the first time, just a short overview as to how this works. I'm going to introduce our speaker in a few minutes, or in a minute or two. She will then make her presentation, and at the end of that, we have an open Q&A session in which we encourage you to raise questions, bring your ideas to bear on the issue of the day, and share your own thoughts with the speaker and with our community. Later on, you'll see Associate Dean Dina Rollinger, who's the brainchild and the real visionary behind the Policy Pub. She actually created this about 4 years ago, in which tonight's speaker was our first guest. And she will moderate that Q&A session when we get to that point. I just wanted to make sure I thank you for taking your time on a sunny Tallahassee evening. We haven't had a lot of those recently, and joining us to learn about the Florida Charter School Movement. We've got one of the foremost experts in the state and nation who's helped work in this space, Dr. Carol Weissert, who's a professor of political science in the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy. Carol is one of the absolute intellectual forces and lights of our college, and it's a real joy to have her speaking to this topic tonight. Dr. Weissert, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you again for being, first of all, our inaugural speaker a few years ago, and then picking up the baton again this time. So Dr. Weissert, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean Chapin. Thank you, Dr. Rollinger. Yeah, and thanks for inviting me back. Yeah, it took 4 years, but I came through again, so I'm happy to be back. The backdrop here, in case some of you don't know, is it's the Grove, which is the home of Governor Leroy Collins, and it's now part of it's now a state museum and quite lovely. Glad you can join us this afternoon. As Dean Chapin said, I am a professor of political science and also the director of the Leroy Collins Institute. And the Leroy Collins Institute does research that's important to the state of Florida, and in the name of Leroy Collins. So we are very cognizant of the importance of what we do, and we want to make sure that it's good. I'm going to talk tonight about a report that was issued last year at this time, but it still hopefully will be relevant for you, on Florida charter schools. And I want to say before I get started that I think we have in the audience some of the co-authors of this report, and I want to acknowledge them. Kenneth Mackey and Alex Artiles and Matt Uttermark were all students who worked on this report for the Collins Institute. And education professor Carolyn Harrington was a consultant on this project. So this was very much of a joint effort, and I get to talk about it for you, but they are very much participants. The study really followed some work that the Collins Institute had done on what we call resegregation of Florida schools. This was done several years ago, and we really highlighted the fact that Florida schools had become more segregated or resegregated today. There was a period after the 60s that it got better, but now it's resegregating, as are a number of other states. And so we started this really looking at, okay, what are charter schools and how is their relationship to resegregating? So that's one of the key things that we looked at in this report. The bottom line is in the title. Florida charter schools, not as good or as bad as advertised. Charter schools have become very partisan, very divided, much like a lot of our politics today, where people think, oh, they're terrific. They're just the best things that ever happened. And on the other side, you have people say, these are the worst things that have ever happened. And it really is they are somewhere in the middle. So I just tell you that kind of as the bottom line, kind of when we get started. A brief background, probably most of you are familiar with this, but I want to just make sure everybody is. Charter schools are public schools. They're public schools in Florida and elsewhere, so they get public dollars. So sometimes there's a mix-up with vouchers for private schools, which are a different entity. So we're talking about charter schools, which are public schools, but they are given more autonomy. So we'll talk a little bit about accountability, because that was one of the things we looked at. Florida authorized charter schools in 1996. They actually started earlier in that decade, so we weren't among the first in the nation, but we certainly have been big users, and I'll show you that in just a second. But it's interesting, maybe from a historical note and a political note, of course, to say that the first charter school in the state of Florida was opened with great fanfare with the support of Governor Jeb Bush, who was not yet governor then. He had run for governor and lost, but then he won after that. But so that was the it's just a kind of a little political connection there. In the early years, charter schools were often supported by teachers. In the 80s, the teachers union was very, very supportive of the idea of charter schools. And the idea was largely that teachers who had sort of chafed under regulations under the state and local government and their school district, would have more freedom to really teach. And so that was kind of the idea of it. Over time, charter schools have become very different from that kind of conception, and they don't often, sometimes they don't have the support of the teachers. Now I organize this as sort of by claims. You could solve the myths, but they're not really myths. So I'm going to really sort of say, here are the claims that are made about charter school, and I'll tell you what we found. The first one is clear cut. Florida is a big user of charter schools. Yes. This graph shows you from 2000. Remember, 1996 was just the beginning in Florida, and Florida was about probably not the leader in the country. But you'll see that the red line is Florida, and this is percentage of students enrolled in charter schools. So this is not the number of charter schools. This is the sort of their penetration, if you will. And the blue line is the rest of the country. So you'll see that Florida is a big user. We were sort of going along together with the nation, and then around 2008 we really sort of took off, and so we are very big users of charter schools compared to states in the rest of the country, especially South Florida. I'm going to talk a little about South Florida several times, because South Florida, as many of you know, has a very different kind of feel, and certainly they do with charter schools. So this is another graph. The red line is Broward County, the blue is Dade County, and the sort of orangish one is Palm Beach County. The green or the black or whatever in the bottom is the rest of the state. So this gives you a sense. The rest of the state's kind of moving gradually in terms of their adoption. Again, this is percentage of students in charter schools. And you'll see that Broward and Dade and Miami Beach, particularly Broward and Dade, and Palm Beach, Broward and Dade are big users, more so than the rest of the state. I told you that we were interested in racial diversity, and we also looked at economic diversity, and we compared charter schools to traditional schools, and again in Florida. And the answer is yes and no. In terms of race, let me show you. I'm just going to show you 2016. In the report, we have we follow a number of years, but you'll see that traditional schools are a bit more white in Florida than charter schools. Black in terms of the whole state, pretty close. And it's in the Hispanic category that you really see that charter schools have a much higher penetration, much higher representation of Hispanic students than do traditional schools. And traditional schools are just the non-charter schools. So a big difference with Hispanic population of the charter schools. And if you look at South Florida, again, you get a sense of this as well, that Hispanic, about 54% of the students in charter schools in South Florida are Hispanic. So it's a big reach for that population. And of course, a lot of those kids in South Florida are Hispanic. But it's interesting too, in these three counties, you begin to see a split where the traditional schools have a much higher representation of Black students than do charter schools. So in those three counties, then the white schools are about the same. So we see some differentiation across the state in terms of Hispanic, and then in those three counties, we see some differentiation both with Hispanic and Black populations. In terms of economic issues, these are economic disadvantaged kids. So these are typically, the measure is free and reduced lunch. They've changed a little bit to talk about economically disadvantaged in 2016. But you'll see there's a big difference here. So traditional schools have a much higher percentage of their students on free and reduced lunch than do charter schools. So some difference in terms of racial disparities, but also we see a big difference here in that it is the poorer kids are in the traditional schools, not the charter schools. This one is a complicated one, but maybe one of that'll be sort of relate to some of these good or as bad issues as I talked about. Florida's heavily reliant in for-profit charters, which further segregate Florida schools. And the answer is this one is yes. People who study charter schools look at sort of three different categories. EMOs are called education management organizations, and those are big companies that operate charter schools, dozens or sometimes many dozens of charter schools under their umbrella, and they are for profit, so they make money on their endeavors. The something called CMOs are not for profit. They are also kind of go across a number of schools, but they don't make money at it. KIPP is probably the best example of a nonprofit, but there are a number of others as well. And then the rest of them are freestanding, or we call them freestanding, and the literature calls them freestanding. Okay, so think about EMOs as the for-profit charters. And you'll see that Florida is a big user of these for-profit charters. 47% of charter school students in Florida attend these for-profit entities. And that compares to 18% across the country. So this is something this is a definition, or part of the definition of charter schools in Florida, is that they are really dominated by these EMOs. There are 33 different EMOs operating in Florida. So there are a whole variety of them, and the top 8 operate 244 charter schools out of about 654 in 2017-18. In Miami-Dade, 77% of charter schools are EMOs. So EMOs are probably more controversial because they are for profit, and they are the ones. Sometimes there was a sort of a scandal in Escambia County and others. If the scandals have typically been in EMOs. The EMO Giants across the country, 2 of them are based in Florida, Academica and Charter Schools USA. One's in Miami-Dade, one's in Fort Lauderdale. They have a number of schools in Florida, and they have a number of schools across the country. So they are big players in Florida, especially. This relates to the racial breakdown of EMOs, CMOs, and freestanding. Remember, EMOs in the middle are the for-profit, and the green line is Hispanic. So the thing that strikes you about that is that these for-profit entities in Florida, a lot of them are in South Florida, and their population is the Hispanic population. The 3 bars on the left represent the not-for-profit entity, and you'll see that they have a little bit more of a white population, although they don't have, the bars aren't as different. They have fewer Hispanic, and then the freestanding are the ones on the right, and again they have more a white population as well. So this again really talks about South Florida, EMOs, and Hispanics. The claim for Florida's system of accountability and oversight regarding charter schools is strong. So here I would say yes, but. And I thought it might make some sense to go walk through with you again. You know, they are public schools, but they have autonomy. And what does that mean? To whom are they accountable? Well, the Florida law really is strong here in the sense that charter school students take the same state assessments as traditional students. Their schools are graded. They take the same exams, the statewide measurements that we take on math and science and a variety of things. They have state reports that are published on their scores and on the data on a number of socioeconomic variables. So we have a lot of good data on charter schools in Florida. Charter schools must report publicly on management and organization issues such as quarterly auditing report and a variety of other variables. So there are some additional kinds of things that they have to do as charter schools. They must accept all students, and if a school is oversubscribed, the students are chosen by lottery. So these are just sort of ground rules that relate to accountability. Charters are granted by local school boards for 5 years. So it is the local school boards that grant the charter. But a denial by a local school board can be appealed to the state. And maybe many of you are aware of or vaguely remember, or maybe you have a closer remembrance of the situation a couple of years ago in Leon County, where our education supervisor, superintendent was against the school board approving 2 new charter schools in Leon County, and the board actually did vote against these 2 schools. And the Rocky Hanna's rationalization was that he had tried to have a new elementary school in a part of town that really needed an elementary school. There was a geographic argument to some extent, and the state had turned him down. But now these charter schools were coming into town, and they were not located where the school board, or certainly the superintendent, thought was really important. And so the board turned them down. One of the 2 dropped out. One of the 2 appealed it to the state, and then the state overturned the local board decision, and that charter school did open in the fall. So there is accountability at the local level, but then, you know, there is this kind of a workaround, if you will. Schools with track record of strong performance may receive charters as long as 15 years before they apply. So some, you know, those are good schools, but that's kind of a long period of time, I think, that some school boards might think before they really assess them. A charter school with a grade of F for 2 consecutive years automatically sees its charter revoked. So that's not up to the school board. What we've seen in recent years is the state chipping away at the school board's responsibility under the Constitution. The Florida Constitution gives that to the school board. But there have been a couple of ways where, including that sort of F wing I just mentioned, where the state says, well, you know, we want to make sure that it goes the way we want. One of the interesting things that they did a couple of years ago was something called Schools of Hope. And the idea here was they wanted to encourage more not-for-profit charters to come to Florida. I think recognizing we have a bit of a misbalance. And so they said, if you are not-for-profit, you could be certified by the state, and then you can go into certain underserved areas and start a charter school there. Again, it's a state authorization. And so a lot of local people went, wait a minute, what's going on? I thought the local government was supposed to do this. It's been somewhat slow getting started, but my understanding is there are a couple that are going to be started fairly soon in Tampa. And with a group called the IDEA is one of these nonprofits. But again, the idea is that school boards are kind of accountable until maybe they aren't. And then, of course, many of you know the takeover of schools in Jefferson County this was again by a CMO, a not-for-profit group, not a for-profit group. There was some talk in the Constitution Revision Commission several years ago about sort of circumventing the state, the school district. So that's been kind of an undercurrent in recent years. Charters must meet most of the state traditional school requirements, but who has the authority to oversee these? So there's the school board, but if the school board has, in fact, authorized the charter, what is that authority? There's also an issue in accountability with local boards. This is primarily for the EMOs, the for-profits that have a lot of these schools. They tend to have a centralized board, and then a local school will have a parent representative to that board. So the local boards maybe aren't necessarily local, which is kind of what I think the intent originally sort of had been for the state. Transparency is also important. The idea of charter schools is competition, and that parents will have information available, and they'll be able to say, oh, this charter school is doing this in this, my traditional school is doing this, and therefore I'm comparing them and I'm picking out which one is the best for my child. We stuck an undergraduate with looking at web pages of a randomly selected group of both traditional and charter schools to find out what kind of information do they have. Racial information? Do they have schools test scores readily available where you don't have to be an expert on computers to find out the answers? And we found that both the traditional and the charter schools had, many of them did, traditional and charter schools had poor transparency. It was very hard sometimes to find out this information. The state collects the information, they make it available, but it may not be getting to the parents. Claim 5, charter schools are innovative and lead traditional schools to become more innovative. So I'm going to come back to this a little bit, but the answer on this one was no. Part of the problem is it's very hard to define innovation. Is it kind of one of these things we know it when we see it, but how do we really measure it? So the state has struggled with that, and so have other states. But the interesting thing, and it's really part of the rationale for charter schools, because they're more innovative. They deal with all the rules and regulations. They have more autonomy, but we don't really know for sure whether that's right or not. And they aren't being held accountable for innovation. So and one of the things that we noted, and talk about recommendations in a bit, but the state really needs to make sure that there is a sharing of information. So if you do have an innovative charter school, let's learn from that. And there really isn't a mechanism now for states, a formal mechanism or for that sharing of innovation, if we ever define what innovation was. Charter schools do a better job than traditional schools. This is not something we actually studied in great detail per se, but in Florida, it's measured through school grades, achievement on standardized tests, learning gains, graduation rate. There's a lot of research on this across the country, so we didn't try to replicate that. And so I'm just going to say that at least in terms of 2015-16, it looked like charter schools had higher A grades than traditional schools, and traditional schools had more C grades. But again, I'm not going to talk a lot about this because this is a whole nother subfield, and we didn't spend a whole lot of time on this. But one thing that I think you will find interesting that we did spend more time on was this argument. And I just was looking on a webpage of one of the not-for-profit chains in Florida last night. And one of the arguments, they make this very argument, and they say, when we come into a neighborhood, the traditional schools get better. And it's what's called a competition argument, right? So this is stop whining traditional schools when we will make everybody better. And this is a hard one to study because you can't just look at kind of groups. And so what we did here, we looked at the 3 large counties in Florida. And what we did was a longitudinal study, and we said, we looked at traditional schools. So here's a traditional school, and here's what happens in that traditional school when a charter school moves in within a mile. This is a pretty close radius, but there are a lot of charter schools in South Florida. So what we actually looked at was, and then we looked over time. So here's the first year, the second year, the third year. So this was a much larger data set. And we're looking to see in Florida, in the largest 3 counties, did the traditional schools get better in terms of their grades. We looked at grades, the percentage of students who passed certain grades that everybody takes, and we found no evidence. We didn't find that they got better. And we also looked over time, because the argument is over time, people will go to the charter schools and then go back or whatever, it'll change. We found no evidence. So that argument that's still on the website of these charter schools, at least in Florida's top 3 counties, we did not find support for. We also looked at the opposite of that is skimming, which is that actually the charter schools are taking away the good kids from the traditional schools, and they're skimming off the good kids, and therefore that when they come in, the grades are lower, and we found little support of this in math, but basically the skimming hypothesis didn't hold up either. So with this pretty interesting little data set that we had, we didn't find that. The competition one doesn't work, but the skimming one doesn't work either. And then we also looked in the same area, the same focus on these 3 districts. We also found no evidence that charter schools, when a charter school came in, that left the traditional schools more diverse. We just didn't find that. And that's actually counter to previous research and nationally on this. So bottom line, charter schools are not as good or as bad as advertised, but they can be improved. And I'm not going to go through recommendations, but to just give you kind of a sense of the kind of things that we were talking about in terms of this series of recommendations, we did recommend more accountability and an oversight, clearer kinds of roles for the school district role that makes sense for both the school district and the charter school. And this would be, maybe it also sort of stay out, give guidance to the school districts, but the Constitution says school districts, so let's let them do their job here. Measuring innovation. This is not something that's new to us, but it's something that's very important, and it's something the state of Florida could do, is to try to develop some notions of innovation and figuring out, if you do find an innovation school, share it with charter schools and traditional schools in a systematic way. Improve transparency. Let's help those parents so that you don't have to, take a computer course in order to figure out what you really need to know in making a choice. And revisit racial and economic issues. The 1996 law setting up charter schools really talked about racial diversity and as being something that was really important to charter schools. And since that time, it really hasn't been dealt with in state law. We've moved on to a lot of other areas, but not that. But again, this is the racial area. There's some differences here, but it would be interesting to have the state revisit that, and the economic issue one, because that is one where it does look like that's something that people that there is a disparity here between the traditional schools and the charter schools that just makes some sense to go back and kind of revisit that. So that is it. So on this hot topic, I'm happy to answer any questions or clarify anything, or to hear from you on this topic.
Great, thanks so much, Dr. Weissert. We really appreciate you giving us that overview of that of your amazing study. So Susan had a couple points in here. So this one I think is more of just a comment. She mentions that charter schools don't have to teach courses required of the district-run schools. But she asked a question about the nonprofit versus for-profit, and she wondered if a nonprofit can use for-profit management companies as well. So, and she notes, and KIP allows real estate investors to profit. Can you talk a little bit more about how this?
Yeah. I don't know, Susan. You may have to talk about this, but yeah, that's true. The nonprofit, there are these EMOs which sort of operate the schools, but there are also these companies that do functions for schools. And so as a nonprofit school, you might hire one of these companies to do something for you, whether it's curriculum or budgeting or a whole slew of kinds of things. But it's not really called. You're not owned by those companies. You sort of subcontract to these companies to do that kind of thing. So, but the entity itself, the KIP entity, does not make a profit, whereas, Charters USA as an entity does.
If you have a question, you can also raise your hand, and so we can call on you that way as well, or use the Q&A box. I was just curious, I'm very interested in charter schools, but I don't know that much about them. And I've really been curious about, why are they so popular in Florida? What is there about Florida? Is it just easy to set up a charter school, or is there something else that is happening in our state?
That's really a good question. We don't, Florida is this Florida law, different scholars have done this ranking of states, kind of the easiest to the hardest in terms of the requirements on charter schools, because states do differ enormously on this. And Florida comes off as pretty supportive of charter schools, meaning it's pretty easy to, we don't have a whole lot of restrictions on charter schools, although those accountability ones are really important. But I think that there is I guess I go back to sort of political culture. Florida is a big state, and we sort of like businesses. And I think that the argument that charter schools can provide your kids something that they might not get otherwise in a more structured kind of environment is a very persuasive one. And there are a lot of really, really successful charter schools that do sort of target, whether it's classics or athletics, or, there's just a whole slew of charter schools that are able to say, this is our area of expertise. And if you want your kid to come to this area, we're able to do it. So there's a specialization too that charter schools are allowed to do, that, as Susan said, the traditional schools can't do that necessarily. I certainly can't do it as easily. And so it's, I think that's really appealing to a lot of parents, that you can go to a school and it really is kind of focused on this area that you think is really important to your kid. So I think it's a combination. I think we attract a lot of the for-profits because there's a lot of money here. There's a lot of, as you said, in South Florida, I do have a map that I didn't show with all these little dots, but it's amazing how close the charter schools, how many charter schools there are. So there's a lot of opportunity. Nationwide and in Florida, the charter schools tend to be most often located in bigger cities. In the rural areas, you don't see nearly the kind of thing, there's not sort of the market for them for the EMOs. So that's kind of a combination of why parents are interested, and also kind of why I think why the EMOs are coming to Florida.
So Richard raised his hand. So Richard, I have unmuted you so you can ask your question.
Thank you very much. I'm Rick Edmonds. I am a ringer. I'm a member of the Collins Institute board and a huge fan of Carol's.
Thanks, Rick.
This project, but we won't go on and on. I do have a question. In our early work, we got some background on the national scene, and among other things, which I don't think everybody knows, there are many pockets where charter schools are huge. They're about half of the schools, the public schools in Washington, D.C. They're the entire school system in the New Orleans area. And I wondered if, nothing to belong in the report, but if you had any impressions of best practices or takeaways from that national scene that might be relevant to us as we go forward.
Oh, that's an interesting question, Rick. I'm sure there's been a slew of work on charter schools, and particularly and they have, as you indicated, focused a lot on DC and particular urban areas. One of the real frustrations has been, I think, that it's been hard to generalize from there. And so we don't have, there's certain kind of best practices, I suppose, in terms of how you conduct your curriculum. But, and certainly there are associations of charter schools that sort of share kind of best practices. But oftentimes, because the state laws vary so much in terms of accountability in terms of who authorizes the charter schools, and again, this kind of overlay between the sort of the EMOs and CMOs and all this kind of stuff. It's been very hard to some extent to have kind of a set basic thing on kind of the best practices, or that's my sense as well. And that the problem is that, even within the state of Florida, so we said, okay, we have the state, but we had to really separate out South Florida from the rest of the state. And then, so if you're doing a 50 state study, then you really got a lot of noise in there. So it's really hard to get things out. But if you go down and delve down into one jurisdiction, whether it's New Orleans or DC, then you've lost a lot of, you've got to make decisions within this context. So I think one of the frustrations with charter school research, or somebody who sort of delved in just a bit, is that there's so many differences, and it's really caused us a lot of problems, and the results for a lot of the research are really mixed. On the one survey will find one will find it. So I think that there's still a lot that needs to be done here, and I think you're right. I think best practices is the best. I think innovation is the best area to pursue, and everybody knows this. This is not something unique to us, but it has been so difficult to do. But somehow defining innovation and sharing that would be really a big step forward.
Brittany, I'll get to your comment in just a second. It looks like Susan wanted to weigh in. So Susan, I have unmuted you.
Yeah, so about the question of diversity, do you think that charter schools or even the magnet schools should require a certain level of diversity? I'm in Jacksonville, Florida, and our history is that magnet schools were created to get us away from forced busing, but now the magnet schools nor the charter schools are diverse. Is there a way to force them to be diverse?
No, it's the short answer. I think that's a very, very, very tough question, because we can't force people to do it. I think, well, one of the things that we would like to do, though, is just, again, make this an issue that it's transparent, what is going on. Then it's school boards. A lot of times the school boards do look at this, that this is an issue for them. And part of it is placement, right? If you plop down a charter school in a totally wide area, and charter schools don't have to provide transportation, then the likelihood is that charter school is not going to be very diverse. So what can the school boards, work with the charter school and say, well, what about if you move it, or you come here, or you recognize this, or what can you do if you do have their charter school in this area? What can you do? Can you provide transportation? What can you do to try to encourage diversity? So it has to be done that way. Long term, this gets at our resegregation report too. There are issues of affordable housing, but it is a major issue that really goes beyond the charter schools and the school districts to the county commissions and to city commissions. I don't think the state is very much interested in this, but I think at the local level, there might be an issue, not just for charter schools. I wouldn't say just for charter schools, but look at the charter schools and traditional schools and see what's going on, and see if there's some way that those school districts can provide some incentives for, as you mentioned, magnet schools was certainly one of those efforts. But it's not an easy thing to solve. But we can't make them take a certain percentages.
Yeah, so both Brittany and Rose had related kind of questions. So Rose asked exactly about this higher middle SES communities. So is there a trend where charter schools established within these counties, or are they very arbitrary, or are there decision rules that will determine whether or not you put a charter school here or there? And Brittany asked particularly about the Hispanic students. Is there, or do you have any thoughts on why the schools, particularly in South Florida, are drawing the higher proportions of Hispanic? Is it just simply location, or are there other related factors?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm guessing it's location and maybe a few other factors. But I might say too, one of the things we did look at that I'm not showing you is we looked at by race, and then we looked at performance, and we found that that Hispanic kids do very well in schools that are largely Hispanic. In terms of those schools are pretty high performing schools, often high performing schools, even controlling for a variety of other kind of variables. But Black kids did not. When the Black kids are in highly Black schools that are highly segregated Black, their test scores are low, and they start getting low in elementary school. So that's kind of an aside here, but it's really kind of interesting. But I think it's a market, I think, for Hispanic schools. I think in South Florida, it's a very profitable market. And as I said, a lot of those Hispanic schools are very high percentage Hispanics, and they are pretty high performing schools. The question about location again, Rocky Hanna tried, that was his argument about location of the charter school. So when charter schools come in, they have a certain place that they want to go. So whether there would be whether there would be up for negotiations with the school district, if the school district says this is where we really need you to go, that again is something would have to be done sort of informally, and at least in the case of Leon County, I guess, did not occur or wasn't successful.
And Susan also asked a question about, so this is sort of related regarding profit models. So, and what is the profit model for Florida? Is it, so she notes in New Orleans, a school district would own the building, but that's not necessarily true in Florida. So a building can be sold. How does that fit into all of this?
Yeah, I'm going to punt on this. We're doing a second piece on sort of capital funding, and it's probably Susan knows and other people know that the legislature has opened up. Initially, they could charter schools did not have capital funding, and that's part of the reason the company would buy the school and then rent it to the building and rent it to the school. But the legislatures in recent years sort of move toward capital funding, but that is a very complex area, and I'm gonna punt on that one. We are doing what that led us into. We started off sort of looking at capital funding for charters, and we ended up, the whole report's going to be on sort of capital funding for both traditionals and charters, and it's kind of still underway and very complicated. So I'll punt on that and give you an answer maybe in about 6 months or 8 months.
So we have a question about what's going to happen with the legislature and charter schools. Do you see any changes or refinements this year? If so, what do you think will be on the horizon? And if not, does this suggest that the state believes the charter school model is sound?
I think the last question is yes. I think the state's pretty happy with the charter school model. My sense is that its unhappiness is in the for-profit sector, and that they think that it is way out of whack compared to the rest of the country. So that's what the whole Schools of Hope was about, to try to bring in and attract more of the nonprofit groups. And my understanding, and I'm getting into capital funding again, but I think capital funding plays a role in this as well, that it's been somewhat of a problem for nonprofits. But my sense is that the legislature is not doing much with charter schools this year, except for implementing the Schools of Hope. It's taken a while. It was 2018 and it was passed, but and they don't have any yet. So I think they're really trying to work out the details on that. As they said, I think there are 2 in Tampa that are going to be opening up, so that'll be interesting. What they are doing is vouchers, and a lot of times, these schools of choice include both vouchers and charter schools are lumped into that notion. And so I think that the vouchers, they're trying to expand vouchers and to consolidate. We have a whole slew of different vouchers, so they're trying to consolidate and expand vouchers. So I don't think charter schools are going to be on the agenda. Could come up, but I haven't heard of any.
Okay, once again, if you would like to put a question in the question and answer, please feel free. Looks like we have something in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and I can unmute you in that regard. Let me head over to the chats. And so we have a question about what have recent studies shown regarding charter versus traditional schools on performance? I know you addressed a little bit of this. Do you have some additional thoughts?
Yeah, it's all over the board, actually. It's again, but a part of the problem is the sort of the design too. If you're taking it sort of a cross sectional and you have traditional schools and you're comparing them to charter schools, which is kind of what we did, and which is the reason I didn't spend a whole lot of time on that part of it. And you find that it's not exact. You're not really controlling for, well, what kind of the population of those schools, did in fact, are they different in some significant way? The other thing that that people do when comparing them is to look at it, and people have done this in some studies in Florida. They look at individual students. So if a student, they look at the sort of the rather than the school itself, they look at the school grade. They look at students and students' performance in charter schools and traditional schools. But again, it's in our study and other studies, you try to control for a variety of things, but the research largely is inconclusive. Some I would say most of it is inconclusive. Sometimes they find that charter schools really are better. Sometimes they find they are traditional, they're worse sometimes, but mostly they find that it depends or it's kind of inconclusive. So I think that's part of that stuff. But again, you're got to keep in mind, there's so many things going on here with the type of school, with the type of traditional school, with the state law, with the school board oversight, so there are just lots of things that are going on that make it really difficult to make a good study. There are some good studies, but there's no sort of definitive answer.
Good research takes time and money, right?
Well, there's been amazing, when we got into this, I was amazed that there's a lot of really good research. A lot of people are really looking at it, but it is very hard.
So since we have a little lull, I want to just make sure I quickly plug our next events that we have coming up. So just a reminder, if you're looking to read about any of our faculty research, any of our teaching, or some of our student research and internships and scholarships, check out our blog. It's www.wicked-solutions.blog. We also are on a variety of social media. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook at FSU COS. We are on Instagram at FSU COS. We have a YouTube channel where you can watch this and other college events. So anything that you've missed, not a problem. Just head on over to our YouTube channel and you can see the events there. We have a couple more events that are related to the Policy Pub or the college more generally. So last semester, we started something called Wicked Webinars. And our Wicked webinar, if you missed it last semester, was a panel of our faculty talking about their ongoing research related to COVID. So we had economists, we had public administration, and we had planners. And we had the sociologists. So we had a great panel. This upcoming next week, next Thursday, we will have Dr. Tisha Holmes, and she is an urban planner. We have one of the best urban planning departments in the country, so I have to brag on that. And she does this wonderful community research, and so she'll be helping moderate a conversation about community research and talking about Tallahassee's Providence Neighborhood Association and some of the challenges that planners face and these conversations between communities and local governments. And our last pub will feature our dean. So Dr. and Dean Tim Chapin will be talking about the future of higher education after the pandemic. So that event is on March 16th, same time, same place, your living room or wherever you want to watch these things. So feel free to register for that. So let me get out of here so I can actually see Zoom again and see. Again, you can raise your hand, or if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A. So I'll give it a couple more minutes, just another minute. So so it sounds like you have a next step for your research project, Carol. Is there anything else that you all are exploring?
Anything else to what?
What else are you exploring related to the charter school project?
Yeah, I think that this capital funding one, as they said, it's become kind of a nightmare of capital funding. It's one of those things where when you start peeling the onion, it's just it's amazing. But yeah, I think that one is, and then we're moving on into some other things. We have a piece coming out with some of the FSU planning faculty on climate change and implications for relocation in Florida. So when climate forces people to leave, what's that where are the people who live in those areas now going, and why should we be thinking about it? And we should be thinking about it. And then we're sort of shifting gears a little. We study areas that are important to Florida, and so not necessarily education. And so then we're looking our next in the future, we have a couple of things that we're funding on police reform. So we'll be on community boards on police, and also on use of force in Florida, the laws related to that. So we have a wide repertoire of things. There are lots of policy issues in Florida for us to get into.
Well, that sounds amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your time. Last chance if you want to raise your hand. If not, I would thank you so much for coming and learning more about the important work that's being done in the college and at Carroll's Institute. I'm giving you credit for the Institute, the Leroy Collins Institute. Once again, we'll have our last event for the Policy Pub will be on March 16th. And we have an event next week, a Wicked webinar. If you're interested, please go to the College of Social Sciences website, and you will find a calendar of all of our events and an easy link so that you can sign up. Thank you again, Dr. Carol Weissert, for all of your work and for sharing your time with us this evening.
And thanks to the audience and your good questions.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.